welcome everyone to today's session on working in a virtual environment. I'm really excited to have our client partner here today, Toni Freeland, who is the Director of Learning and Development for Wolverine Worldwide. Welcome, Toni.
Welcome, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great. So this is actually a topic that I'm extremely excited about. This is what I did my dissertation on in graduate school, this whole idea of how do you navigate a virtual environment given all the complexities that we're used to in today's business world. And so, as I mentioned, I'm excited to have Toni here to sort of take you through some of Wolverine's challenges related to ensuring that their leaders were set up to work effectively in a virtual setting. And we'll also share a little bit about not only the challenges, but some of the best practices that they leveraged. Before we do that, I just wanted to take a moment to briefly introduce OnPoint and have Toni do a brief introduction about Wolverine. So OnPoint is a global organizational and leadership development firm. We focus on several practice areas, strategy, execution, succession. We sort of have a broad array of leadership development programs, and we work on skills related to working in a virtual setting and navigating the matrix. And as I mentioned, this is an area that we've been doing research on for years. So we've done 4 studies. The last study on virtual teams was done in 2010 and was a global study, the results of which were published in our book, Virtual Team Success. So again, this is an area that we do a lot of consulting in, and one that we have worked with Toni on at Wolverine. So Toni, do you want to take a minute to introduce Wolverine?
Sure, thanks. So Wolverine, we are a global footwear and apparel company, primarily a footwear and apparel wholesaler, but we are also a retailer, global organization founded in 1883, so we have a very rich history. We like to brag about the fact that we took Hush Puppies, one of our primary brands for the business. We took Hush Puppies global in 1958, which is, if you know anything about kind of global business and global expansion, that was before the world of global. So we truly are a global organization headquartered in Rockford, Michigan, which is just outside of Grand Rapids, for those of you that have some familiarity with Michigan. Wolverine is in more than 200 countries and territories around the globe. And oftentimes individuals don't recognize the name of Wolverine Worldwide, but they do recognize one of our 12+ global brands. So some of our brands include Sperry, Saucony, Merrill, Hush Puppies, Cat Footwear, Harley Davidson, and many other great brands. So I'm just pleased to be here and looking forward to a terrific session.
Thanks, Toni. So before we dive in, just to give you a quick look at what we'll cover today, as I mentioned, we'll spend a few minutes talking about what the specific challenges that Wolverine had related to working in a global setting and due to expansion and other factors. And Toni will then sort of walk us through some of the obstacles they faced, how they got the buy-in needed for training, as many of you probably can relate to. That's often really the main hurdle. We'll talk a little bit about how to measure the success, and Toni will talk a little bit about sort of what's next for Wolverine towards the end, so you can get a feel for sort of the progress that's being made, which I think is great. And then at the end, we'll do sort of a brief summary of some of the best practices that we've learned both in our research and our consulting for training virtual leaders. So before we look at some of the challenges that Wolverine faced specifically, I think it's important just broadly to set the context for why does this matter? Why are we talking about this? Why is it important? And as I mentioned, we did a global study in 2010 of more than 50 virtual teams. And surprisingly, frankly, we were quite surprised, more than 1/3 of the teams were not perceived to be performing at an effective level. And almost 50% of stakeholders who were objective in rating the leaders of the teams were not seen to be performing at a high level. So when you think about the types of investments that many organizations are making in virtual work, telecommuting and making sure that people can work virtually, et cetera, one has to think that, what's the return on investment? And many of these organizations had no idea that their leaders and these teams were not even perceived to be effective. So that's hopefully what we'll get to talk a little bit today is how can you measure the success of some of these initiatives and make sure that your virtual leaders are set up for success.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the Wolverine Challenge and what we were looking at and what we were experiencing when we started to engage with OnPoint. And so just for a little backdrop or some history about Wolverine Worldwide, back in 1995, the company had 3 brands, and those were pretty good, stable brands that we had had for a long time. In 97, they started an acquisition model, and so from 97 to 2012, our company was purchasing, buying, acquiring a brand about every 12 to 18 months. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of new people coming into the organization. Some of those individuals were located, in our Rockford corporate complex. Some of them were located remotely, globally. So our challenge really became that after numerous acquisitions and a continued global expansion, we had a lot of challenges communicating and collaborating across our virtual teams. And our virtual leaders really had difficulty motivating their teams, holding them accountable. They really struggled to understand that virtual leadership is a bit different than face-to-face leadership. So when we set out to develop a program, some of the goals that we were looking at is first and foremost was to help raise awareness that managing a virtual team is different from managing a team that's face-to-face or that you're co-located with. And so that may seem kind of like a duh, but oftentimes managers don't step back to really think about that. So we had to do some research and some education around our company to help leaders understand that how you manage that person sitting next to you is different than how you manage that person that may be 2,000 miles away from you. And you need a different set of skills in your toolbox in order to do that effectively. So our second goal was really to equip those virtual leaders with the skills and the tools that they needed to be more effective in their roles. So when we were looking at selecting the right training, some of the criteria, the factors that we were looking at was something that was research-based. We really wanted to make sure, because I'm not an expert in virtual leadership, I wanted to make sure that we partnered with somebody that had some good research to back up why the training was important, how the training could help, and what type of difference that training could make. We also wanted to make sure that the training was cost effective. We're a publicly traded organization, and cost is always an issue for us. We wanted to make sure that that training was practical and actionable, and also scalable, something that we could take whether it was a small group of individuals or if we wanted to do a number of global cohorts with this particular training. We needed to be able to customize the training to fit our needs, and finally, it really needed to be easy for our business leaders to adopt and to use the skills. And I think that kind of goes back up to that practical and actionable. I really wanted the training not to be a lot of research and theory, but a lot of practical applications so that when somebody walked out of the training, they had tools that they could immediately take and apply on the job to become a more effective virtual leader. So some of the obstacles that we had to overcome, and I'm sure some of these obstacles might be similar or different for you depending upon the type of business that you're in. Our first obstacle was, again, the awareness, that virtual leadership requires different skills than traditional leadership. So there was a lot of knowledge sharing, expectations, a lot of good marketing that went around the program to help people understand that there really truly might be a need for them to improve their skill set in this area. We also really wanted to focus on global participation. So our training department is located in Rockford, Michigan. We tend to get great participation from our Rockford, Michigan-based employees. Where we struggle sometimes is with that global participation. And so having a program that was virtual, something that we could push out around the globe was very important to us because we knew that this was not going to work if it was a Rockford-based program only. We also needed to set a budget. When we first started speaking with OnPoint about this, I wasn't aware that we had a need in this area or that the need was as great. So we didn't have dollars set aside. So we needed to figure out how are we going to fit this in the budget and kind of sell this to our leadership. And then finally, getting leaders to commit and actually attend. And I will talk a little bit about that later, because that is something that I don't know it's necessarily unique to our culture, but we do sometimes have a challenge getting leaders to commit to attend the training that they sign up for. So because of the budget and the costs associated with this program and the visibility of the program, I really needed to make sure that the program was successful and that people participated, attended, and that they saw results for the training that they participated in. So let's talk a little bit about getting buy-in. Some things that worked for us. The first thing was tying the training to our strategy or a corporate value. So we had fortunately just gone through a revision of our vision, mission, values, and so we were pushing out a whole monthly training program around our vision, mission, values. We kind of had a value of the month, and we were doing a lot around that. So I was pretty easily able to take this training program and some of the objectives from the training and tie that into some of our corporate values and make the case that attending this program supports and helps promote our corporate values. Also sharing that research and those best practices, again, that awareness that there may be a need that a leader wasn't aware of. So doing a lot to kind of share research so that it wasn't the Wolverine Worldwide training department saying these things. It was some expert located in XYZ country that was saying these things. We also talked a little bit about virtual leadership mishaps and consequences. So along with the idea of sharing, here's why virtual leadership is different, we asked people for some of their stories around where they've kind of missed the mark. So where are you struggling with managing your virtual teams? What do you specifically struggle with? What are those challenges? What are those difficulties? One of the other things that we did was, suggest a pilot program to evaluate the value. So when we first did this, I wasn't certain if, how it was going to go, how it would be perceived, what the results of the program were. So we conducted a pilot program and we marketed it. We did everything we would do for a normal program here at Wolverine. But for us, it really allowed us the opportunity to evaluate the program afterward, evaluate the value, get great feedback from the participants, and just make sure that we knew, that the program was delivering on what we needed it to deliver on. And then finally, conduct a needs analysis with virtual leaders to understand their challenges. So once you get to the point of you've got a program, you're going to do it, really digging in and asking those virtual leaders where they're struggling in each one of these areas so that you can take that information back and really customize the program to make sure that the program, the examples you're using, all of those things are really relating to the challenges that they're facing in their day-to-day management, in their day-to-day leadership roles. So we talked about setting a budget, and as I mentioned, I didn't have a budget set aside for this. So some suggestions that I would maybe recommend is start small. Focus on one cohort first, and just do what you can do to get a trial program, if you will. And then evaluate that thing like crazy. So take all the data, all the information, and really show that return on investment, for that cohort program. Sometimes you may need a level 4 evaluation in order to get approval for another program. At Wolverine, we tend to, if something gets a lot of good press, a lot of good buzz around the organization, it starts to take off. So we really leveraged that buzz that was going on through the organization, and that helped us to get additional cohorts, which we'll talk about in a moment. Also, when setting a budget, benchmark your spending against industry peers. See what other people are doing and kind of use that as an impetus for your management team to say, hey, we're behind the 8 ball. Other great organizations are doing this, and we should be doing it too. Use annual turnover statistics, performance evaluation data, for your virtual leaders to show what's at stake if they do nothing. And depending upon your systems, this may be a bit more difficult to do, but I think the focus here is oftentimes we will go in asking for something and we don't get creative in our approach. And so if this is something that is new, you may have to get a bit creative, and you may have to pull out some of the research, and you may have to do some digging and some focus groups, talking to individuals, just to get some good analytics and some good data that you can present to management to get that buy-in and support for the program. So getting leaders to commit. We talked about this a little bit already. Ask them what they want to learn. That's one of the best ways. So, making sure that you're customizing that program a little bit to fit their needs goes a long way. Use self-assessments and 360 feedback from peers to determine the needs to determine needs and identify the most pressing needs. So depending upon the robustness of your assessment process, your 360s, your performance reviews, sometimes you can get some good data from that. One of the things that I did was just kept my ear to the wall, and through my experience training managers, training leaders, and researching the best practices, I was able to come away with some pretty generic situations and some pretty generic examples where I asked leaders, does this ever happen to you? Have you ever found yourself in this situation? And when they ask yes to those questions, a great opportunity to then latch onto is, well, I have a program that I think may fix that need or may help resolve that need. And then you can pitch your program because you've already got that hook where they said, yes, this is a problem for me, and this solution that I came forward proposing may potentially fix that. So that was something that's worked really well. The other thing, involve their managers to gain buy-in and support. So this third bullet is kind of a different vein. So when you get a leader to actually commit to the program, one of the things that we worked on and that we had to do was to involve their manager. So we sent their manager overviews of the program. We sent their manager reminders when the employee was going to be, or the leader was going to be participating in the training, so that that manager knew that, okay, today during this 90-minute time frame, I'm not going to bother this individual because I know that they're participating in virtual training, and I'm going to help them free up that time to make sure that they do it. And then on the back side, when the training was over, involving that leader's manager in some action planning and making sure that they are aware of what their employee learned and how their employee indicated they were going to use those new tools on the job. So those are some simple suggestions to kind of get leaders to commit. A couple others, offer incentives. Maybe there's some type of a certification that you can give out if certifications are big to your companies, badges, awards. If somebody completes the full program, they get a free lunch, a free cup of coffee. Again, I would just say be creative about it and, kind of think outside the box. Another thing that was very successful for us was requiring registration and having consequences for not attending, such as charging their department. So our culture is one in which managers and employees will see a training program, they, with good intention, sign up for that training program. The day before the training program happens, or 2 days before the training program is to take place, suddenly their world comes crashing down, their schedule is playing havoc with their time, the child is sick, it could be a whole host of different reasons. So frequently what happens with us is we would sponsor a training program, get great sign up, and then a couple of days prior to the event, the registrations would start dropping. And because of the cost associated with this program, and because of the visibility with the program, what I needed to ensure was that the leaders that were going to attend had some stake in the game and that they wanted to participate in this as much as I wanted them to. So we were very transparent about the fact that when we pulled our marketing materials together and we pushed this out to the organization, and even on our LMS, we had very clear language around the fact that an employee would be charged XYZ dollars if he or she failed to notify the learning department within a reasonable amount of time that they were not going to be able to attend the training. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that, but that was kind of a creative way for us to deal with that concern. I certainly understand that that may not be a suggestion that would work in every culture or in every business, but it is something that proved to be quite effective for us, and we've used that multiple times with other programs. So let's take a look at the curriculum. So when I talk about the program, there were a couple of pieces to this program. So there was a component on trust, right? So no trust, no team, building trust virtually. We had some conducting effective virtual meetings in the program, influencing remotely, managing conflict, managing accountability, and then how great leaders inspire action and motivate others from a distance. So what we did with our first cohort is we took 5 of these programs and we pulled that together into what we felt was a cohesive module. So we started with a trust program, then we moved into a motivational program, then we moved into a conflict program, a coaching program, and then an accountability program. So I was able to work with the curriculum and order that curriculum so that I felt it would best fit and how it would be most well received. And then a couple of these other courses, like the conducting effective virtual meetings, those were classes that we did kind of offline with different groups of individuals. So there was a lot of flexibility in how we could arrange this program. So we talk about the participants. So we had 45 global participants over 2 cohorts. They represented a very diverse background and geography. We had individuals from Michigan, Boston, Canada, the UK, and even our office in China. So it truly was a global program. Each leader was asked to commit to at least 4 of the 5 modules. So again, in those marketing materials, we explained the program, the 5 90-minute sessions that would take place over a 5-week period, and then we asked each leader not to sign up unless they were able to commit to attending 4 of the 5 programs. Because what we did not want to happen is I didn't want individuals jumping in and out of the program. While each one of the modules, so while the trust, the accountability, the influencing courses, they're all intact courses that could be completed by themselves, I really felt the big value and the big benefit was through going through the program as a whole. So I wanted to ensure that if somebody raised their hand and said, I would like to participate, that they were truly raising their hand to sign up to attend 4 of the 5 modules. Again, we mentioned this, attendance was mandatory. Departments would be charged if their employees didn't attend. And that really did remarkable things for the attendance. And some people might look at it as you're threatening attendance, and I guess in some respects is true. I look at it as is an incentive to do the right thing. They were told up front what the consequences would be if they chose not to attend, or if they just said, hey, something came up, sorry, I can't be there today. They were told very clearly what those consequences would be, and then it was up to my team to follow up on those charges. And unfortunately, there were a couple of individuals that did not follow the requirements, and their department was charged the fee that they were indicated. Now, what that did was obviously it generated a conversation, but it also drove attendance to the next session as well, because they knew that if they missed the next segment, that they would be charged. So it really did prove to be a pretty good accountability tool. When we talk about the format, I've already alluded to some of this. We had 5 90-minute webinars. Each webinar included some pre-work and some post-session action planning. The pre-work took anywhere from, I think, at most 30 minutes to complete. Most of the pre-work was pretty simple. There were some self-assessments that were in there. The pre-work volume and length varies from module to module. And then one of the other things that I made a requirement of each session was some post-session action planning. So after each segment, I asked the individuals to reflect and to share 1 or 2 things that they learned from the module and how they were going to apply this on their job. And then I also asked them to share that information with their manager so that their manager could help with that accountability and ensuring that they were actually utilizing the skills learned in the training. And then I would follow up periodically with assessments and evaluations to see how they were doing. The sessions were spaced out bi-weekly so that we could space out the learning. Some cultures, it might work okay for the learning to be weekly. In our culture, asking somebody to commit to an hour and a half every week for 5 weeks, I felt might have been too much, especially since this was something, virtual learning was something we had not done a lot of. So spacing it out every other week helped space out that learning and also helped make the schedule maybe a bit more palatable for everyone. One of the other things that we really had to focus on was a convenient time zone. So as I mentioned, we had individuals in the UK, and probably more restrictive were the individuals from China that were participating, because no matter what time I selected, it was not a great time for them. And one of the surprising things for me was kudos to our Asian team that we selected a time of 9 o'clock, and you know, that's depending upon where you are, 8, 9, 10 o'clock, you know, over there. So we had many individuals that would log on to a webinar at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. and stuck with it. And I think that's kind of a testament not only to their, you know, willingness and desire to learn, but also a testament to the program, because they stuck with it, you know, for 5 consecutive sessions. And, you know, that's asking a lot when you've worked all day and you're tired and you just want to go home and you have to log into a webinar for an hour and a half at 10 p.m. So, and some of you listening on the webinar may have that same challenge, and it's not always something that can be, you know, resolved easily. One of the other things that helped us was that we did record each one of the sessions, so that if an individual advised ahead of time that they were not going to be able to make it for some reason, or what did happen is in China, sometimes you have internet issues, and so we did have some connectivity problems, and I had a few individuals at 10 p.m. that were trying to log into the webinar, were not able to do so, and so we recorded those sessions so that we could make them available for individuals to view offline afterwards if they wanted to review it again, or for those individuals that truly had a legitimate business conflict and were not able to attend the session for some reason. All right, so let's take a look at some of the feedback, you know, that we received from the program. Overall, I think that the program was very, very well received, and I don't know that I necessarily need to read these quotes to you. I know all of you can read those, but I think it just goes to show that there were very simple, simplistic tools that our leaders took away from the program, right? Shows how we can be more effective accomplishing the team goals as a leader. I'm getting to know my team on a personal level, and I have more of a connection to them. And that may seem like not a big deal, but if anybody has managed someone that is remote, so they're not co-located, it can be difficult to make that connection, establish that relationship, and to kind of operate effectively when there isn't that personal connection. So giving leaders the skills that they need to help them build that personal connection with their employees is huge and has all sorts of tangible benefits, you know, down the road. I've learned how to connect and align with each other to achieve a common goal. Again, seems sort of like a no-brainer type of thing, but when you're working remotely, when you're working in different time zones, when you can't see the whites of somebody's eyeballs, and so you're not sure how your information is resonating, do they agree, don't they agree, giving those leaders the skills and the tools that they need to collaborate a more effective virtual meeting, a more effective virtual relationship, really can go a long way in teaching them how to do some of those things that they tend to take for granted in a face-to-face leadership type environment. So what's some of the practical application pieces? So some of the feedback, some of the results that we received. So before I go into some of these things, one of the opportunities that we had, and it wasn't planned this way, it just kind of worked out. I had a local university in the area that had a graduate program, and it was an organizational design or development master's degree. And as part of that degree, there was a group of students that had to do a case study around learning evaluation and return on investment. So I just happened to be approached by the professor of that class, and they wanted to partner with Wolverine to determine if we had a training program that they could use for their class. And it worked out very, very well that this program happened to be new, happened to be something that we had never done before or tried before. And it worked out really well with the timing. And so we were able to partner with this graduate program and these graduate students to actually help us evaluate this program and get us some feedback that maybe we wouldn't have gotten in other ways. So I received, I think it was like a 30-page report on the results of the program. And here are just a couple of tidbits of the practical applications that some of the individuals or the participants pointed out. So more effective meetings with time spent building relationships, proactive planning for virtual meetings. And again, that sounds simple, but it's not. Because oftentimes what happens, and I think we're probably all guilty of it, is you take it for granted when you do a face-to-face meeting. Everybody's going to be in the room. I'll walk in with my agenda. I will stand up. I'll lead the meeting. I'll ask questions. I'll read body language, all of those things that we take for granted in a face-to-face situation. Well, if you've had to lead a virtual meeting, and maybe you have time zones to deal with, maybe you have technology challenges, maybe you have language barriers, maybe you have all of the above, taking the time to actually plan out your meeting. How are you going to involve some of those people that may be participating on the phone versus those people that are in the room, you know, tend to monopolize all the time. So having somebody call that out, that they were actually going to start planning their virtual meetings and giving thought to those, or giving thought to those virtual meetings and what they want to accomplish, was big. And that goes back to our original challenge, was helping our leaders to realize that managing virtually is different than managing face-to-face, and it requires a different thought process, and it requires different engagement tools. So this was a perfect example of that challenge or that objective of the program being met in very clear terms for us. Some other practical application pieces that we heard from some of the participants. Stronger interpersonal relationships and more effective working relationships, more constructive performance reviews. And you know, I remember when I read this, my thought was, what does this have to do with performance reviews? I wasn't quite certain, honestly. And then I had to go back and do a little bit of digging. And when I looked at our module on trust, and we were talking about how to give feedback, how to build trust, what do you do if that trust is eroded, it really hit me then that, yes, in an environment where you may not get to see your direct report ever, maybe once a year, maybe once or twice a year, it is difficult to build that relationship and to build that trust and to be vulnerable with that individual like you might be willing to be vulnerable in a face-to-face situation. So giving them, again, the tools to build that trust and to hold individuals accountable, directly related to the ability to have a more constructive performance review. And a more constructive performance review, in my book, translates into a more engaged employee, a more excited employee, and somebody that wants to come to work and do a great job. Also, the ability to address conflict more effectively. Nobody likes to deal with conflict. Most managers giving difficult feedback, giving negative feedback is not high on their wish list and not high on their favorite things to do in a day. So to have somebody call out that taking this program or this course helped give me tools for how I can handle that conflict and how I can deal with the conflict. Again, because put yourself in the situation of a face-to-face conflict situation. I can see the individual's body language. I can hear the inflection of their voice. I can see their facial expressions, the tone of the voice, their posture. All of those things come across. If I am communicating with my employee and there's a conflict situation over the phone, over WebEx, goodness forbid, over email, it's really difficult to convey all of those things. So just giving the individuals the tools that they need to deal with that conflict and ideas and suggestions for how to have those conversations in a more effective manner. It was great to hear somebody call out that they actually took that into place, or took it into to heart and did something with that. So what's next for Wolverine? So the program went so well that we are planning, we did a cohort in 2016, we're doing another cohort yet this year, and we have 2 additional virtual cohorts planned for 2017. Before I move off of that, one of the things I don't know that I made real clear was that this was a virtual program, and that was a new thing for our leaders. Our leaders were very used to face-to-face training, and so this program, the topic, lent itself very well to a virtual program. What better way than to teach leaders how to be better virtual leaders than to demonstrate those skills in a virtual training environment. And so while there was a little bit of apprehension and maybe a little bit of a concern initially going into this, like, oh, how is this virtual thing really going to work? And what if we have technology problems? And what if? It actually turned out to be such an effective method of training for us that it really laid the foundation for us to have the courage to do more training virtually. And some of you may be way down that path of virtual training, but our culture was one in which they really wanted to see your face and they wanted to be in the room with you if they were going to receive training. So over the past 3 to 4 years, we've really kind of pushed that global piece, that virtual piece, and also pushed that web-based piece. So this program was a big part of that. And it laid the foundation for our new global online curriculum. So we actually have some initiatives that we are doing now in-house that this program kind of gave us the impetus and the permission, if you will, to be able to do, because we knew that it had worked with our virtual leader program, and we were taking some of those same concepts and emulating that for different audiences. And then finally, it also helped kind of serve as a launching pad for a global team performance survey, which is going to help us assess the health of not only our face-to-face leadership in teams, but also our virtual teams, and give us some great recommendations and ideas for kind of what's next in the area of virtual teaming and what can we do to help equip our leaders so that they can be the most effective virtual leaders that they can be. So with that said, that's the Wolverine story. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Darleen, and you can talk a little bit about closing the gap and how to implement some of these best practices that I just shared in your organization.
Great. Thank you so much, Toni. I think many organizations, at least, organizations that we work with and that we hear from, are experiencing similar challenges. So hopefully, hearing the story makes them realize, first of all, they're not alone. And some of these challenges are not insurmountable. So thank you. And in a minute or two, we'll open it up to some questions. And I'm sure many of you have questions for Toni about some of the specifics. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a few minutes and just share a few best practices that came out of our research related to some of the things we're talking about here, particularly about making sure your leaders are successful in a virtual setting. So I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that, we had the results of our global team study, and one of the things that came out of that was called the RAMP model. It's relationships, accountability, motivation, and sort of process. And so I'm just going to talk briefly about two aspects of that. But what we found is that teams who performed sort of at the top third of the group spent much more time on relationships. So relationships are critical. I mean, look, we all know they're critical when you're co-located, but when you're virtual, as Toni mentioned, some of these skills become much more challenging. And so what we found is that the best-in-class virtual teams find ways to sort of mitigate or address the fact that there's this distance gap. And so meeting in person initially is a best practice. The top third of the teams in our study met within the first 90 days of working. And many of those, because they were such large global teams, did virtual sessions, sort of a virtual kickoff when they couldn't fly everyone together and do dinners and some of the more typical things that you might do when you're closer together. So meeting in person is critical. Again, if you can do it in the beginning, that's great. If not, finding ways through virtual coffee chat, through one of the teams in our study was such a big global team that they would have lunches, and in order to learn more about the different cultures, they would share and rotate the lunch items so that you can become more familiar with what people eat in different cultures. So really just trying to find ways to not just focus on the task, but really get to know the people that you're working with, even though you're not face-to-face. Another leader, he was a leader of a global HR team. One of his best practices was just calling people to say hi. He called them care calls, which might, when we talk about this sometimes in training, people think that's a little weird. But if you think about it, it's sort of like running into someone at the water cooler. So again, I think the leaders who are more successful find ways to really try to close that distance gap and sort of figure out how they can touch base with people in an informal way, not just at the beginning of conference calls, but also informally. And then using things like instant messaging, I'm sure many of you use that, using different technologies where possible to sort of replace in-person meetings. So using a series of virtual meetings, as I said earlier, is also a best practice. And then in addition to that, if you think about the RAMP model, the A is accountability. And one of the things that we found is that if we looked at the leaders who were not perceived to be successful, remember I mentioned about almost 49% of leaders were not perceived to be effective by their stakeholders, those folks really struggled with accountability. And if you think about it, if leaders are not really great at holding people accountable when you're face-to-face, think about the difficulty of not having that body language and all the cues that you have when you're coaching or giving someone feedback. And so what we found is that many leaders just didn't really think about or put a lot of emphasis on creating a defined purpose, being really clear about how the team should communicate and what's expected of the team's goals. And again, the sort of best-in-class leaders leverage technology to help manage the team's deliverables. So using, different kinds of collaboration sites and different software tools. Not that you want to overwhelm people, but you want to make sure that technology matches the task. And so really thinking about what technology do we need as a team, and how do we make sure that we're all up to speed on priorities and objectives and deliverables. So that, again, is something that's really critical. And one of the things that we found is that leaders often did an okay job establishing expectations up front, but over time, as people get really busy and are pulled into different things, what we found is that people weren't necessarily being updated as priorities shifted, and as the team continued to work together, often people were less clear about what was expected over time. So again, just sort of balancing the relationship and making sure that you're also focused on accountability. And then, not surprisingly, one of the things we found in our study was that the teams in our study who went through training, skill-based training, outperformed those who did not. So if you think about the top third of the virtual teams that I keep mentioning in the study, those teams had more than 2 skill-based training sessions, like what Wolverine did on topics such as these. These are just examples. But again, I think the idea here is that if leaders struggle with some of these things, managing conflict and building trust and influencing, if they struggle with that anyway, and they're not really the best at some of these things, these issues become exacerbated in a virtual setting. And leaders often just don't have not only the skills sometimes, but also don't necessarily leverage technology and processes well to set themselves up for success. One of the things that we developed coming out of the book that we wrote and the research study that we did was an online business simulation. So, one of the things I mentioned sort of anecdotally at the beginning was when we gave the organizations who had their virtual teams in our global study the feedback about how their teams and leaders were performing, many of them were frankly quite surprised at how ineffective some of these leaders and teams were. And so one of the things we developed was an online business simulation called Leading from a Distance, where it gives people an opportunity to go through a series of scenarios, almost sort of to test your virtual leadership IQ, if you will, and they get feedback at the end of it. So it's sort of like a week in the life of a virtual leader, but in 20 or 25 minutes. And what we did is we looked at how the best-in-class leaders would respond to these scenarios and use that as a benchmark. And so at the end of this brief simulation that's online, people get a sort of little feedback report that aligns with the RAMP model and gives them an idea of where they're perhaps strong and maybe where they have some opportunity areas. So that's something that if folks are interested in wanting to get an idea of how your leaders are doing, that's something you can certainly contact us about. But I think that the message here, from my standpoint, is that it's really important, as Toni mentioned, to sort of check in and make sure that your leaders are set up for success, to make sure that they have not only the skills, but also the resources that they need to perform effectively in a virtual environment. So with that, let's take a few minutes and open it up to some questions.
Great. This is John. I'm helping out with these guys. And I guess this first question is for you, Toni. Kristen Haynes asks, what technology is recommended for virtual meetings? I know you've mentioned WebEx in your presentation. What other tools do you use for collaboration and just keeping virtual teams working efficiently?
Yeah, so that's it's interesting. WebEx has been our primary platform, so I would say some type of an interactive program. Now, for the training itself, we used, I don't remember if it was WebEx or GoToMeeting, but something like that, because we were not the host of it, but something that is very collaborative where you can whiteboard, you can break out into meeting rooms. So I think one of the important things for a virtual training program is that you're trying to emulate a lot of things that you would do in a classroom environment, right? So when we think of virtual training, sometimes we all get that, we get in our heads the 2-hour sit and just listen to somebody talk and they never ask me a question and I'm multitasking and doing other things. One of the things that I will say about this training is there were polls throughout the training program. There were virtual breakouts. Now, it's not without its challenges trying to do virtual breakouts. You always have somebody who's sitting in a coffee shop, on the phone and you can hear all the background noise or what have you. But we tried to really emulate what you would do in a classroom environment for robust discussion. So, and I think that was great for our leaders because they saw the GoToMeeting tools and then that gave them ideas so that when they were facilitating meetings that they might say, okay, well, instead of just having my board old PowerPoint deck that I email to everybody, maybe I will do a WebEx meeting and I'll utilize some chat features or I'll throw up a whiteboard. Maybe I can't break people out into virtual meeting rooms and have discussion, but by seeing the training conducted virtually, it also gave leaders ideas on how they could be more effective when they're holding and leading, virtual conversations.
Another
So,
question.
and I guess part two of that would be make sure you have sometimes you may need a video conferencing platform where you can actually see people, or don't be afraid to turn on your webcam every once in a while. I know nobody really likes those webcams, but it does go a long way in actually being able to see the person's face instead of just hearing a voice all the time.
Andy Bergen has a question. How do you overcome the elbow-to-elbow bias of people who just don't like distance learning or working in a collaborative environment?
Sure, I can start with that, and then Toni, if you want to add, that would be great. I mean, again, this is something that many organizations face, and I think it's really like any change, it's a change management process. So you've really got to educate, you've got to get people comfortable with technology, which is often, as Toni mentioned, people don't like video, for example. You've got to get them comfortable doing things differently. Working virtually is different. And I think demonstrating the effectiveness of different tools like collaboration tools. I think people are often surprised at how much technology can really do and in terms of saving them time and resources, but they've got to invest a little bit to get up to speed typically. I think oftentimes it's also helpful to make sure that people have sort of a sense of community. One of the things that we found in our research is that it's very easy for virtual workers to feel isolated and become less engaged just because they're not often seeing people in an office perhaps or things like that. So how can you replicate that in a virtual manner? So all of the things I mentioned earlier, like the virtual coffee chats and having group texting and Facebook-like kind of pages, not literally, but pages where people can talk more informally. But again, like with any change, I think it really is a process, and you've got to educate people and really sort of bring them along.
Another question.
Yeah, and I would just
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask another question, but go ahead and follow up.
I was just going to add, that's a great question because it's very relevant, and we received that same response. When we put our marketing materials out there, in my opinion, I kind of thought, well, it's a no-brainer. Of course it's going to be a virtual training because we're teaching people how to be better virtual leaders. But I did get a lot of pushback around, well, why can't we do this face-to-face? And so part of my response was, this is a great way for you to experience what it's like to be on the virtual end, right? Maybe give some empathy to your employees and understand what they're going through every week when you have this conference call with 10 people and, the technology doesn't work and people are talking over each other. Those types of things. But it also, I told all of our leaders, it'll give you some great ideas and suggestions and tips for how to, not only be a better virtual leader, because the facilitator of the training program is emulating what he's talking about, but it will also give you ideas for how to be a better meeting moderator just by participating in the virtual thing. So you've got to be a little bit creative in how you spin it. And I think one of the other things is don't give them the option of doing it as an instructor-led. So if somebody really wants the topic and they really want to do it, then the only modality that they can do it is virtual. And, people do adapt and they do figure it out, sometimes a little bit more slowly than what we would like.
You mentioned that your meetings in the first go-round were 90 minutes long. How did you arrive at that number, and did you think that might be too long for a virtual meeting?
We went with the research that OnPoint provided. So that was one of the things that we had talked about, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and really to achieve kind of that balance between the participants sitting there and, wanting to spend the time, and also balancing my needs as the learning head of I want them to learn something and I want them to take something away. We kind of agreed that 90 minutes was kind of the maximum amount of time in that sweet spot, if you will. One of the things that I think also helped that was that the facilitator for the program, like I said, was very engaging and very interactive. So we think 90 minutes like this, where you're just sitting and listening. I know 60 minutes, it's hard to sit there and just listen to somebody talk. But for this training, it was very interactive. So every couple minutes, we were doing something. So trust me, I was a fly on the wall, just trying to see how the program was going and how it was trying to be perceived. And so I kept trying to disengage and do other things. And then I would find, oh, I have to pay attention here. Oh, I have to pay attention here. And so it's very difficult for the participants to multitask, disengage, and do other things. So that hour and a half really went very quickly. It felt like you were in an instructor-led classroom, or as close as you could be without physically being in a room with other people. So the 90 minutes after I experienced it was not a concern for me at all. Initially, I could see where it would be a concern. So, letting people know that it is 90 minutes, you will get a break in there, and you will be, kept engaged and involved the entire 90 minutes, and it goes faster than you would think.
Okay. Our final question is really kind of one you've answered, I think, already, and it's about working across multiple countries and time zones. Did you have any other sort of examples or comments about how to do that effectively without sort of losing people and impacting the registration and attendance?
One of the things we explored, which we didn't actually do, and I think we will probably do this going forward, is to maybe do an Asia cohort all by itself, or maybe do like a UK and Asia cohort where some of those time zones, maybe, to chunk off regions of the country that maybe are in a little bit of a closer time zone. That may allow you to get a time that is a bit more agreeable to each party. Because what we were trying to do is do it early in the morning, which we knew was going to be late at night in Asia, but it was going to be early afternoon, mid-afternoon in the UK. So we were trying to, get basically 3 different regions of the world. It worked. Was it easy for our Asia employees? No, it absolutely wasn't. So I would maybe recommend, if you have a large body of people in a certain geographic region, that maybe you do a regional cohort for that group, so that it's not as, that the time doesn't become the reason not to attend the training.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think those are all great ideas. For many of our clients, we have tried to come up with really creative times and sort of rotate either meeting times or virtual instructor-led training online, where it's, people can join from multiple time zones. But we have had multiple clients where we've had to do separate sessions for Asia Pac just because of, to accommodate that group and the size of the group. So I think that's, unfortunately, sometimes we try to be flexible, but we have to accommodate, more individuals.
Okay, that's all the questions we have.
All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. And Toni, thank you. You did a tremendous job sort of walking us through your story, so thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to do it, and I wish everyone the best of luck as they go explore how to take this information back to your workplace and start doing some virtual teaming.
Great. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.